Did you ever wonder why clinical trials fail? Then listen to this episode.
At the beginning, you should talk, I would say even to five different CROs at different sizes, but look at their experience, see what they can do. Do they have the regional experience, the indication, the sites? So they have a lot of these presentations they can provide you, and there must not be only the shiny dog and pony shows.
Did you know that almost 90% of all product ideas fail in clinical trials? Here is the thing. Most of them not because of lack of efficacy. This is episode number 71, in which I talk about clinical trial management, especially about the topic how to rescue a clinical trial when it is at risk to fail. The most obvious reason that a clinical trial fails is a lack of efficacy or safety. And efficacy is one of the core goals of every clinical trial. Based on the results, a trial can be successful or fail. Surprising to me, however, was that lack of efficacy doesn't seem to be the main reason why clinical trials fail in the first place. Other factors are at play, and most of them are manageable risks when the right team is at work. The problem with failing trials is that it becomes a costly endeavor for sponsors and investors. Taking out manageable sources of failure during the clinical trial can help gain speed, save expenses, and decrease the probability of success. The big questions when it comes to clinical trials are: why do clinical trials fail? What factors are manageable risks in clinical trials? What can a sponsor do to manage them? After reading some studies on this topic, I asked Heike Schön to join for a podcast recording to explore this area further, to find out what sponsors can do to make clinical trials successful and reduce the risk of failure. Heike Schön has worked in management positions in clinical research for more than 20 years. Her experience ranges from conducting national and international phase 1 clinical trials all the way to registration and post-marketing activities in various indications. She had positions within the contract research organizations, CROs, and in the biotechnology industry. Her previous positions also included operational and general management. She holds a master's degree in psychology and a master's degree in business administration. Since 2002, she has been active in the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, where she also served as a member of the board of trustees and as its chair in 2010. Heike is a regular speaker at international conferences and publishes within clinical research and medical device magazines. Lumis International Limited was founded in 2013 with the goal to act as a bridge to Europe for clinical research activities. The company is specialized in providing legal and data representation, services, and regulatory consulting for biopharmaceutical and medical device companies who intend to develop their product in the European market, but are located outside of Europe. Lumis Life Science Consulting was founded in 2020 as an independent subsidiary of Lumis International to provide customer-tailored consulting and solutions for clinical vendor selection and management, clinical trial oversight, quality management, and training. Flexibility and empathy are core to the Lumis brand. They go the extra mile to support the clients. Questions we will discuss in this episode: strategic considerations for setting up a clinical trial, in-house versus outsourced clinical study management, why do some clinical trials fail, steps to getting your clinical trial back on track, future trends of clinical trials, and much, much more. Enjoy the show. Heike, it's good to see you. How are you today?
Okay, fine, thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me for this webinar.
It's good to have you here. Heike, how is life in Berlin these days?
Perfect. Sun, blue sky, warm weather. That's perfect.
That's very good to hear. Today's topic is clinical trials, especially when clinical trials fail. Can you give the audience a little bit of your background, a little bit of context to the episode? What is Lumis International and what are you doing?
Okay. So shortly to me. So my name is Heike Schön and I'm the co-founder and managing director of the different Lumis companies. We are meanwhile a Lumis group. And my background is I have worked more than 25 years in clinical research in different CROs and also in the biotechnology industry. And in 2013, we as 3 shareholders, we decided that we can use our knowledge to help companies, especially small to mid-sized companies outside of Europe, to come to Europe, to help them coming to Europe as legal representative, to represent them. Because when you are a company outside of Europe, you want to conduct a clinical trial in Europe, you have to have a legal representative. And we 3 shareholders are very knowledgeable in this field. One of our shareholders is a lawyer, a pharma lawyer. The other is a medical specialist, a key opinion leader, as you can say, and myself with a clinical research operational background. So we thought this could be a successful team to help companies coming into Europe. It turned out it was really a good idea. And a lot of companies have, meanwhile, received our help to establish them in Europe. And with these activities, more and more, the interest of companies were coming towards us. Can you help us finding a CRO? Can you help us managing the study? Do oversight. What is going wrong with my study? So we have started more and more moving into a consulting business. And then we decided, okay, this is a different business. One is the legal representation, but let's have a separate company. So we founded Lumis Life Science Consulting 2 years ago, just 1 week before the lockdown in Germany started. But this is also catching up very nicely. So we are working with companies outside of Europe to support them in oversight management, in vendor selection. And we do this also meanwhile for a lot of companies within Europe. So I think this is a nice part that we can combine our knowledge, not only outside, but also inside of Europe. And then the Brexit came. And with the Brexit, of course, another change came to us because we are also the data representative for companies when they come to Europe. They also need a data representative, not a data protection officer. This is different, but the data representative. And in UK, of course, you have to do this by having a subsidiary in UK. So we opened up our London office. So now we have 3 companies supporting in Europe, outside of Europe, in UK, and we have a representation also in Switzerland so that we can also cover legal representation within Switzerland. So that's the background from Lumis. And due to all of our experience working here at Lumis and the founders and our projects we are running, our idea came up to talk about a topic which is, I think it's an important topic, and a lot of companies have experienced rescue in clinical trials. And so I think it was a great idea that you said, okay, let's have a podcast about it.
Yeah, that's. I think this is one of the most important topics ever. When I started in life science in 2006, I saw these high failure rates of products that mostly fail in clinical trials. And I always thought it's about science, it's that scientific failure. And I think the number is about 90% of all compounds that go into clinical trials don't reach the market at the end of the day. And today, I'm very happy that you're here because we can now dissect this problem and look at it. And it's not really only scientific reasons, or scientific reasons are only a minority of reasons why clinical trials fail. There are other factors that are in play. And one of the factors that I experienced in my life is always one discussion. When is the right time to start a clinical trial in a company? I mean, you take the compound from university and then you have years and years ahead until it reaches the clinic. What is your opinion on the right timing? When should companies, when they plan to do anything, any trial in human beings, when should they start thinking about clinical trials?
I would say as early as possible, because whether it's a spin-off from university or you're a founder of a completely new company, I mean, first of all, you have to have a business plan before you do any of your business. This business plan always contains clinical research and clinical activities, preclinical.
But it's 2 years down the road. So
it's 2 years down the road, but as the preparation of a clinical trial takes also quite some time, I think it's very important to start as early as possible to streamline your preclinical results with your plan of clinical trials, because this always has to match. Otherwise, you would get problems also with the regulatory approvals of clinical trials if your preclinical data and your clinical plan is going in diverse directions. And so I would always recommend to start as early as possible to use the results of your preclinical data and in connection to your synopsis, to your target product profile, which you have to develop at the beginning, and see that it's streamlined. So I think I can only recommend as early as possible.
I completely agree with that. I like this backward thinking. So thinking back from the market, and clinical trials are part of the way to the market, and implementing that in the companies early on helps also, as you mentioned, in planning the business. Another thing that I always experience that I'm curious to hear your opinion on is you have a company, and the company is in preclinical development or translational research. And then a company starts planning the clinical trial. And there is one concept of, we give it to a CRO and we don't have to worry about anything anymore afterward. You just need a CEO and you need a chief scientific officer, and that's it. And you can wind down the rest of the company. The clinic is running and job done. How is reality? How is the reality for a sponsor, in your opinion?
Completely different, of course. It's, clinical research, or general, the drug development is a very highly regulated and acting in a very highly regulated environment. And therefore, you have to fulfill a lot of duties as a sponsor when you conduct clinical trials. Even you can outsource 100% of all your activities. That's no problem at all. But the final responsibility is always with the sponsor. So there is never the situation just having one person taking a little bit care of a clinical trial when it's going on as a CRO. No, there is much more work to do. It has the proper planning. The selection of the CRO is very important. And it needs a lot of resources also to oversight a clinical trial.
Can you go a little bit deeper? You always had the feeling that being a sponsor is the cool part of the job. You just have to invest the money, and then you can relax, sit on the beach, and watch the waves coming in. What is the role of a sponsor? Give a little bit more detail, please.
Yeah, so we have ICH GCP and the revision of R2, which clearly defines the role of the sponsor, and this is you have to comply as a sponsor with the duties. You have to oversee the clinical trial. You have to prove that you oversee the clinical trial. You have to have the finances when you start your clinical trial. You cannot make a full contract, for example, when you don't have the full amount of money. You can go for part contracts. And so you have to make sure that the protocol is in adherence with the disease, with the indication. So there's a lot of roles. The quality management is a big issue. Of course, as a sponsor, you have to ensure that your quality management systems is in place for the whole activities around drug development. And all these activities have to be done. And so that means, why do you have to do this? Of course, to guarantee the safety of the patients, but also to be at any time inspection ready. You might not have an inspection when it comes to your first in-human study, but at latest at phase 2, inspections could come up, and they will look really at the details, how you did your oversight, your planning, your vendor selection, how did you validate your vendors, how did you qualify your vendors. These are all the activities you have to ensure in a proper way. And the good thing is FDA and EMA, they publish inspection reports, which is very interesting if you want to learn what to avoid. And that's also, these inspection reports, they always lead to changes in regulations, to adapting regulations. That was one of the reasons why ICH was also revised, because more and more technology became important in clinical trials. That means also for a sponsor to ensure that all their vendors providing the technology have validated systems, revalidated systems. And these were findings from inspections, which then led to a change in ICH GCP. And
let me ask you one question. Who should feel as a sponsor? So what organization? Is it the CRO, or is it the company with the money bag that hands over?
No, the CRO is definitely the service provider, and that's also defined in GCP. The sponsor is the company providing the financing and the organization and the compound for the clinical trial. Of course, you can also be co-sponsor so that you have two different companies moving forward, but the responsibility is with the sponsor, not with the CRO. They have other responsibilities.
So basically, you can say there's no time to sit on the beach because a company.
Unfortunately, not.
So any company that raises money and that engages a CRO for conducting a clinical trial and hands over their money back is then automatically the sponsor, and it's within the responsibility of the sponsor that everything runs well in the clinical trial. And when push comes to shove, the regulatory authorities go to the sponsor and not to the CRO. Is that the right understanding that I got?
No, the CROs will also be inspected. So when you have an inspection on a clinical study, let's say in a phase 3, then the inspectors go to the sponsor, to the CRO, and to the sites. So they do quite a multifaceted inspection to see whether the study is in compliance with the regulatory requirements and guidelines. No, this will be all over. But the sponsor company, not the investor gives the money, but the sponsor company who defines what the plan will be, what the drug will be, they are the main responsible party.
So basically, when we talk about, I think everybody knows BioNTech, meanwhile, after 2 years in the pandemic and the vaccine development. So basically, the sponsor of the clinical trials was then BioNTech, but yes. Not the shareholders of BioNTech.
No, not the shareholders. The shareholders might be the responsible part, not the investors, but the shareholders. So that I think we have to maybe distinguish here.
Yeah, but the executives at the end of the day are then responsible that everything runs fine in the company. And it's similar on the private market. So the investor, the VCs that give the money are not the sponsors, but it's the company in between, and the executive board then has the responsibility for the clinical trial and should be ready to be inspected once they dose the first patient. Mm-hmm. This leads me to the next question. What is your recommendation for the time that the company should then take to plan a clinical trial properly?
Yeah, this is also, again, a backward approach. I mean, there are different aspects to it when to start preparing a clinical trial. One key aspect for me is what takes the longest to prepare. That could be the drug, the investigational drug. Because sometimes, depending on the ingredients, it could take up to 1 year that everything can be ready. You have to get the material from wherever. So I think you have to consider always what takes the longest time to be developed. Because maybe you want to start in 12 months a clinical trial, but you need 16 months to prepare your investigational medicine product. You should start earlier. And from this on, you can start preparing further on. And I think, and companies do it very different. I have realized sometimes they do on short notice the CRO selection. Others, they start already 1 year before the study starts to really talk with CROs, to get the input from CROs, to get the input from specialists. I think I would always allow for much more time to prepare and to discuss in detail the plan of the clinical study with the regulatory authorities. You might go for scientific advice meetings. You might discuss with certain authorities. And so therefore, at a minimum is 1 year, but the more, the better.
So a minimum is 1 year that should be taken into consideration also in the planning when asking for money. And you mentioned before, the clinical trial needs to be financed entirely before filing with the authorities.
It should be. It's a recommendation. I mean, of course, it is not always possible. But if you can foresee that you might have an issue with the financing, then and CROs are used to it, you can have maybe only a contract covering the study startup, because then you can have some results in the study startup with the CRO. Because it is also a problem when in the middle of the clinical trial, suddenly you have no budget to continue. So this is not in the interest of patients, not of the authorities, and definitely not of the sites. So I think you should be more careful in the financing process. When you start your clinical trial, you should have the awareness about what is needed throughout until the end.
I couldn't agree more. Having properly financed company and also the resources set up helps then moving forward. Let's jump to the time when the study started. I very often get the perception that the study oversight is also an easy-cheesy job, even with the inspections of authorities. And sometimes companies say, why should I engage outside people? I have a lot of assistants in the company. They can do the study oversight quite easily. Besides the other duties, because what do you have to do? You have to just collect a few reports and that's it. What is your recommendation when it comes to clinical study management, in-house versus Outhouse clinical study management? What really needs to be done in Europe?
Well, if you, for example, the CRO is conducting your clinical trial and you have to make oversight management of the different activities. I think it's not really a job of an assistant because you need a specific knowledge. You should have experienced people, medical person or project managers who can conduct the oversight, you have the awareness about what can happen in a clinical trial, the perspective, the risk management approach. I mean, this is a classical risk management approach where you consider what can happen and how can you mitigate the risks. And so that means even if you have a very good clinical trial assistant, he cannot cover all of the activities, only parts of it. And we always recommend a little rule of thumb, but don't ask me how I derive it. It's when you outsource a clinical trial, for every 6 to 7 person working in the CRO, you should have one person conducting oversight in your company.
Well, let's stop a little bit. For every 6 to 7?
Yeah, let's say 5 to 7 person. For every 5 to 7 person in a CRO working on your clinical trial, you should have one person in your company performing oversight. So if you go for a phase 2 clinical study to be easily in 3-4 different countries, you have at least, let's say, 15 monitors who will work at the CRO to oversee the activities at the sites, 10 to 50 monitors. So that means you have to do some proper oversight management, at least with 1 to 2 person in your own company, to properly work together with the CRAs to review their reports, to use the dashboard the CRO is providing, to look at regular reports, meeting minutes. So this is a kind of a relationship. So that means you have always to consider carefully as a company how many people you have with experience who can do the oversight management. And it depends, of course, in the different phases of the study, and it depends on the different timelines of the study. A study startup is much more resource intensive than later at the end when it comes to statistical analysis and reporting.
So can you give a little bit of insight what proper oversight management should look like in your opinion? So with a little bit more detail.
Wow. I mean, yeah, it's the oversight, of course, what is possible depends also on the CRO you are working with. Meanwhile, a lot of CROs provide excellent business intelligence so that you get access as a sponsor to their dashboard. You can have real-time data. You see what is going on. And this is one thing, but of course, there are a lot of smaller CROs who might not have this technology, but still have a lot of possibilities that you can have access to the reports. So at least what you need to know is as real as possible what is happening in your clinical trial. And then you should always know really what is impacting the clinical trial, the timelines, the costs, the safety of the clinical trial. So we recommend to have good key performance indicators as an oversight measurement tool. If you have key performance, and you don't need many, I mean, it's, let's say 7 to 10 key performance indicators, well chosen, what has the highest impact on a clinical trial, and these can be measured. These key performance indicators can be developed together with the CRO. They have the systems, the data management system, for example, the study startup system. So you define together with them, you get regular reports on the key performance indicator. You don't need to do this by yourself. This is another problem a lot of sponsors have, that they do micromanagement on the CROs. And they double the work. They do a lot of Excel trackers. So I saw biotech companies where I said, okay, these are companies consisting of Excel trackers. Yeah, they tracked everything, but then they lost oversight on all what they tracked. This is not the reason. This is not the sense of oversight. The oversight should really provide you with a clear picture where your clinical trial stands, and also with alerts if something goes wrong. Then you do proper oversight.
Yeah, and I also believe it's a lot about relationship management. with people. I mean, when I think CROs usually work with more companies, and if I as a sponsor want to have a high priority, it's always good to stay in touch with people and manage the relationship so that they feel that the sponsor is also engaged in the study. It was not in the life science industry, it was more in the agriculture industry, but I learned very well back in 2002, 3 and 4, how things change to the better when people are in touch with the person who pays the bills at the end of the day, and things move more smoothly and more quickly.
Absolutely. And this brings to another point, which is very important. Good that you mentioned the relationship. It is the relationship, but it's also the understanding the different cultures. I mean, sometimes we have, small biotech companies, the smallest one I worked with had 3 people, exactly, and everything was outsourced. Yeah. And they have a culture, of course, the decision-making process is without discussions. It's just done by the CEO. The CRO themselves, there were a couple of 100 people. Of course, they had a structure, an organigram. They had very complex decision-making processes. And this can really cause a culture clash because the smaller company was not used to discuss much. And then they suddenly expected decision-making power of people who didn't have any decision-making power. So it's very important for both parties to understand each other's culture and to accept the differences and to work with the differences. And for small companies, you can always consider that the CRO is much bigger and much more complex in the organization than yourself. And so I think then the relationship building is even more important, and but to make sure that you understand each other on a very good level.
I think this is sometimes very challenging because it's not only the culture between the different sizes of the company. So you have these small biotechs with a few people, highly specialized, and then you have the big structures of CROs. Also, trials are very often set up in different countries. And as we are in Europe, every country is proud of their own culture. So
and language.
and language on top of that.
Yeah.
And non-native speakers, we always try to do our best in English, but let's face it, we are not native speakers. Yeah. So there is a lot of management that needs to be done. And I think sponsors, any biotech company that raises funds from investors should plan that upfront and tell the investor what they believe is really necessary to get done so that the clinical trial is at the end of the day successful. So basically, it's not taking a Coke and popcorn and relax and sit down. It's hard work that needs to be done.
Yeah, it is hard work. And it's a lot. It can be easily underestimated, the resources which are needed, the budget which is needed, and maybe also additional resources you have to add to your company. I have made experience that suddenly a company starts with a phase 2 clinical trial, having 35 sites involved in different countries, and they themselves had 2 people working in the finance department. And suddenly all these 2 people on top should check investigator invoices of 35 sites, and it was impossible. So, these are things you have to be also prepared to outsource clinical studies or to run a clinical trial and know what additional resources you might need besides the clinical people, besides the operational people.
So it's not only setting up one contract and then the work is done, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately not.
Can we come up? I started writing with the pandemic 2 years ago, and I did a little bit of research in how to structure articles. And what goes always very well is these 3-step processes, and this 3-step checklist is for sponsors. Can we turn it into a 3-step checklist for sponsors to keep studies on track? What needs to be done? What are the 3 most important steps in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, I think one is what we just talked about is establish a very well communication tool with the CRO, with the vendors. It can be through a governance charter, but really establish good communication with the CRO and very transparent. What we have experienced and what we always recommend is that a sponsor should be very clear on its expectations. Because it's often say, oh yeah, this is a nice CRO, we give it to them, they're nice people, and they just hand over the study. But then suddenly things are happening. Nobody talked before about it. And it was obvious that these expectations were not very clearly communicated to the CRO, to the vendor. Then they do what they think is the right thing. And this could also be a very different opinion from both sides. So I think clear expectations at the beginning, clear developed roles and responsibilities would be the second part. And the third part is also what we just talked, try to develop a good business intelligence, a dashboard, make sure that you have your KPIs in place and work with your KPIs for the study performance.
So it's all about communication and motivations. It's clear management, and this needs senior and experienced people in the working at the sponsor. And this needs also then to be communicated in business plans to the investors and proper funding put in place so that these things can work. So now the big days come. So let's assume we did everything fine. We got millions on a bank account to conduct clinical trials, to do phase 1 and phase 2 studies. And the authorities, ethics committees say everything's fine, protocol well written, move forward. Dose your first patient. What can go wrong then, in your opinion? What are the 3 main reasons why so many clinical trials fail?
Yeah, so the majority of the clinical trials fail. It's because they fail in enrollment timelines. And this is, again, we go backwards, the selection of the sites. Do you have the right sites ready for you to start working? Are they ready for you to start working? And is the CRO ready and initiating immediately the sites after you have a positive approval by the authorities? So this can be, and this has a lot of influence. The study startup is a key activity for your clinical trial. If you have delays in study startup, for example, the sites are not initiated in time, they are not the right sites, because you did not perform the proper feasibility assessment beforehand. So the later a site starts to enroll patients, the later, of course, the patients will be ready for closing again. And so the preparation time is a key part in a clinical trial, to my opinion. And even though you have your positive approval, it doesn't mean that immediately the clinical trial starts. That means another planning and awareness and alertness that immediately all the activities are moving forward. And so, but then still, even if you're doing it, enrollment can lag behind your timelines. And this can result in, because maybe you have involved sites where suddenly when they see the final protocol, that they have only 1 or 2 patients who might fit into the protocol. But beforehand, they said, oh, in this indication, we have 15. So that is easy. And they don't mean it badly, because they still think, of course, they have the patient, but then suddenly the protocol, which they have not seen before, maybe in such a detailed level, shows that it's a reduced number. And so this goes back again in preparing while you are recruiting sites, really to look at what kind of patients do they have? Does they fit in the protocol? And to avoid having wrong sites. Or sometimes when you start your clinical trial, or you change certain aspects in a clinical trial, that can be demotivating for sites, and they also do not enroll many patients. Or other studies are faster in starting and enrolling patients which are in the same indication.
Let's stay a little bit with this enrollment perspective. What are, in your opinion, common factors this leads to a study requiring rescue when we look at enrollment? Let's dig a little bit deeper, because I think this is important. It's, in my opinion, a management work, but I think we should give them a little bit more room here.
Yes, I mean, when you start preparing your clinical trial or you talk with the CROs, you will see CROs will always recommend that you do a proper feasibility assessment. And I think this is key to a startup for a clinical study. You can have, one part is that the sponsor themselves have done some good research in the incidence of the disease and where the patients could be found. And then, of course, the question is whether the protocol and the patients match. So this is one part, but then the other part is the feasibility assessment. And this is normally done very well by CROs. They know sites, they know the countries, they know the incidences of the diseases. And this is a point where you should not try to save money on it, because this is very important information, which could also redirect your clinical study. We have experiences very often that a sponsor had an idea of 4 or 5 countries, and the feasibility results had a different idea of countries, and we should add different countries also then. And this should be taken serious, because the CROs have much more experience as a sponsor has. The sponsor is doing maybe 1 or 2 clinical trials, and the CRO is doing 50 clinical trials in this indication. And when they talk to their sites, it can be much more realistic on the enrollment, on the feasibility of the study in certain countries. And I think this is, I have the impression this is very often also underestimated, the use of the feasibility results, because there could be certain interest. Yeah, I would prefer to go to the Netherlands, to Belgium. It's much easier. I don't want to go to certain other countries. There might be problems with regulatory.
Let's always include Barcelona, definitely.
Yes, yeah. I would also Paris. It's good for springtime. No, but it's. I think it's something which should not be taken. I mean, that no personal interest should be taken into these kind of decisions, but really real data, facts and figures, and then going to the country. And if you are unsecure whether this country would be accepted by the authorities, or talk to them. It's part of your scientific advice. And but I think a lot of when you do, I mean, when clinical trials go wrong, you should do a very good root cause analysis. And one part is definitely the feasibility assessment, that it was maybe ignored or not taken into a full account. So this is, and again, invest in the study startup.
I couldn't agree more. Whenever I saw a clinical trial fail, one of the major reasons was enrollment and miscalculation of the enrollment, which at the end of the day led to a lot of frustration at the investor side. So when the feasibility study, which is done very quickly, comes up with 1 year time until the study is finished, and the CFO then communicates this timeline to the investor, they build up the expectation. And this is the point that you mentioned before, that managing the expectations is key to success of a clinical trial. And after 1 year, when the investors then review the study plan and the reality, and they find out, for example, it's just come up with a number of 20, you need 20 patients, and you have enrolled 2 patients.
Yeah.
And 18 are missing, then the analyst at the investor just makes a rough calculation and says, okay, I mean, if they continue with that rate, we are not finished in 10 years. So what shall we do? And the investor gets frustrated because they say, okay, after 1 year, you are finished and you need 18 patients more. How will you get them? And what can be done in such cases, in your opinion? What are the weak points then? How should people deal with that situation?
Yeah, I mean, there are also different levels. Let's stay with the investors first. I have seen in some companies investors coming regularly for meetings online or in person, like once a quarter or once half a year, and really digging into the details, asking for the progress of the study, understanding if something went wrong or everything is working well. So I think it's also the investors who should be much more involved in overseeing their investment and working with the sponsors. So this would be one part I would always recommend. And I have experienced that it works very well, and it can be a very good relationship between sponsor and investors. And the other part, of course, is to be, again, in real time, at hand, understanding what is ongoing with your clinical trial. So, for example, the majority of the CROs nowadays have study startup managers. These are different from those project managers when patient enrollment starts. So they do all the proper planning when you have your clinical trial application, when the next site can be initiated, and then the site says, okay, when the first patient can be enrolled. These are very critical numbers, and they have to be tracked very closely. And here also the sponsor should always see, is the study initiated? Is the site initiated? When does the site start? Or be involved? I mean, a lot of small sponsors think that they don't need to be involved because nobody knows them. But because nobody knows them, they should be involved. They should go to the sites. Of course, it's a time and resource question, but the more they are also present next to the CRO, the more the sites are very convinced about, let's say, the IMP, which is maybe a new development, a very innovative product. Then sometimes investigators could also be a little bit, reluctant, a little bit hesitant whether this is good or not. But if they can talk to the CMO of the sponsor or a medical advisor who is really knowledgeable in this field, they get much more confidence. And this can also support a lot the enrollment of patients.
No, I completely agree. Active management should not be underestimated. So the impact of active management. There is always the question, how should we deal with people? Is technology enough? And it really makes a difference. Rather, meeting a person once a month over a coffee, just traveling there for a coffee, even if it does cost money, then writing an email. Email can get lost, they can't be read. And when I try to remember the study sites I worked with, they don't do only one study. So they have a lot of studies going on in parallel. And those who stay in touch with the people involved in the clinical trial usually are high up the list on the priority if they manage the relationships really well. Is this a perception that you would also share? Is this something that you also experience similarly?
Yes, I think it's always good to have some personal relationship. But when we look at the last 2 years, this was next to impossible. Everything went online, so it's, but they are now also used to do it online. But you can have an online call with your principal investigator. I think because, now it's not the time that you just drop by and have a coffee because you don't get the permission going into the hospital or anything. But you should try to maintain contact and find out what would be the best way to reach this person. It could be a call, it could be on a video call. It depends, but I think it's still very important to maintain relationship and to build relationship, especially because these are also the future prescribers of your drug.
This is the fine line between micromanaging and managing relationships very well.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that the micromanagement is a problem sometimes between sponsor and CRO, that the sponsor is going too much into the clinical trial and doing sometimes the double of the work this CRO is doing, and tracking all the monitoring visits, which is not necessary because the CRO is doing it also. And but the micromanagement with the site should be also communicated to the CRO. Of course, the CRO should always know when you as a sponsor visiting a site or when you're talking to the principal investigator. But this is part of a transparent, open communication that both know exactly what the others are doing.
I just wonder, most of the time I was working with biotech companies, life science companies, that are basically follow the category that you mentioned, small companies with a few people acting as a project management team. And I always envied a little bit the big corporations, like BioNTech, for example, a listed company, or pharma companies, when they conduct clinical trials in-house, they have a lot of resources. So it always felt to me the reasons that I experience in small companies why clinical trials fail don't exist in big corporations. What is the reality there? Is it also that sometimes these big in-house trials or in-house trials in big corporations need rescue as well?
Well, it's maybe a different type of rescue, but they also have similar problems. It's because these problems do not depend on the CRO only. These are problems which can be sponsor related, they can be CRO related from both sides. And if you don't have a good planning, it doesn't matter whether you're a big pharma or small pharma, your planning is not good. And then you have the problem with the upcoming clinical trial, with the ongoing clinical trial performance. And so they may not call it rescue really, but of course they have also delays in enrollment. And these 80% of enrollment delays are not caused by small companies, they are caused also by big pharma.
Mm. So this is, I think, one of the key reasons, these enrollment problems. And then we have the second key reason, communication problems and managing the expectations, right? What can be done then? One study that I experienced was very ambitious, well-funded, all the money on a bank account, and it really had issues then with the enrollment. So it was this case that I mentioned before. You promise a certain amount of patients, and after 1 year, you got only 2 in the company. when a study is going bad, what can be done? What is within your capabilities then? I mean, I assume from what we discussed that at this point in time, the enrollment failed. The investor is already frustrated. When an investor is frustrated, they need also to do something, and most of the time is exchanging the executive team. And when changes then happen, I think also the communication starts going southward. And then we are in the situation, we don't enroll, we have spent money, no patience, bad communication. Everybody is angry and frustrated. And then they come to you and say, help us, rescue everything. So what can you do in that case then?
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. This is a typical situation. Asked sometimes to join in. Yeah, I think one is, of course, first off, to perform a proper root cause analysis, to see what went wrong, when it starts to go wrong, what has been done. And when we are getting involved, or any third person, I think as a mediator, this role should be really kept neutral. What we always avoid is to blame one of the others. No, you don't want to blame any project manager, either on sponsor or CRO side, but really to understand what went wrong in the whole preparation, in the activities. And it could be the feasibility assessment, a lack of feasibility. Maybe they didn't do even any. Yeah, it's also possible. And then to see if it's bad. Yeah, bad communication is really a difficult part, and this can still happen. And that's why it's also my passion to always optimize the cooperation between sponsor and CRO from the past experience. And here I think it is very important that the companies, senior management, get really involved. And I'm talking about the CEOs and on this level, the C-level people, that they talk to each other. Because we have the different layers of communication. We have the day-to-day work with the project managers. We have the line managers taking care that certain goals are met and that they are streamlined. But then we have also, of course, the C-level and company owners. And I think they also need to talk. And if they can agree on how to improve communication, how to, what activities can be taken, then it will be much easier also for the people to work together and to increase their communication. Because, if on the day-to-day level, the communication goes bad, people are blaming each other. I mean, we have participated sometimes in operational calls where they're really shouting at each other from the sponsor, from the CRO side. This doesn't bring anybody anywhere. And but really try to find the solutions. And what my experience is, sometimes if it doesn't work really on the top level that they cannot find, then you should really consider whether you can continue working with the CRO or adding another CRO for certain services. You must not change completely, but could be added a different CRO partly. But this is what we always try to avoid. I think as a mediator, it should be more our goal really to find solutions that the companies find a way, getting back on track. Maybe they have to change. They have to be critical to them. Each of them have to be critical to themselves. Should the protocol be changed to get better patients in? Should the countries be added? Of course, it's another investment. This is always a problem, but as long as it is transparent and knowledge-based, it can be knowledge-based decisions can lead to change. But then I would also assume that investors can understand it much better when they know what the reason is behind these new decisions or new causes you will direct to.
Yeah, completely.
About communication.
I completely agree with that. This is something that I would like to emphasize a little bit more now. As I said, it's all about communication. And you also mentioned the term mediation. A clinical trial is not a machine. It's not an engine that you just flip the switch and then it runs for 2 years. And at the end of the day, it produces a clinical trial report, study report. It's dealing with human beings and setting the expectations right. You mentioned also the term root cause analysis. Can you explain a little bit more what you are doing with such a root cause analysis? Because I think it's very often missing. As you said, people start shouting at each other and there's a lot of emotion in the room and this just wastes time and energy. How is your process when you bring in this root cause analysis? How does it look like?
Yeah, we look at the different processes which were established at the companies. So what did the sponsor establish to select the CRO, to perform oversight, to manage the study? So we look at the different processes in detail with different specialists. So because we have a quality manager, potentially an IT person if there's a lot of technology involved, and so that we look at the different ways and discuss. And the same is done on the vendor side. And then we also, and the best is to bring the teams together to talk about, from their perspectives, from both sides, what should have been done differently and what has been missed. And maybe, because sometimes certain decisions were not made or they were postponed and they would have been important at an earlier stage. And also the CRO, I mean, the problem is sometimes to get really the transparency in it when it's on a bad relationship level, because CROs are sometimes not that willing to criticize the sponsor also. But it's necessary. They have the knowledge. So they can tell it to us, we can collect the information and we can discuss it backwards also again with the sponsor. But we always try at the end, of course, to get the teams together to find joint solutions. But this is quite a long process. It's not done within a couple of days. It's quite a process which takes time and a lot of discussions. But yeah, this is what we recommend during the root cause analysis.
So it's basically dealing with human beings, which is, I think maybe it's this male picture of seeing everything like a machine, but a clinical trial has to handle a lot of people, and it's a huge management function, and it's managing people, and it needs leadership. I think this is probably the right term. You mentioned that people sometimes are already in this bad state where they start shouting at each other, and this doesn't really help. What is your recommendation for sponsors and investors when they feel that something goes wrong in the study and they don't want to reach this point of no return, where we can say, okay, we can bring you in as a mediator and you do your analysis and try to bring the people together? Are there steps before that sponsors and investors can do to avoid going until that point where the clinical trial is about to fail completely?
Absolutely. I mean, what we have discussed at the beginning, to start to be involved from the beginning, to have established certain oversight management tools, communication tools established with the CRO. If you are doing this, and if you know your contact persons on all the different levels, and I always recommend really to prepare a governance chart. It makes some work and it needs discussions, but then everybody knows exactly whom to talk in which cases, and have escalation procedures in place, because this is also important. If everything works well, it's fine, but you always have to consider for the worst case. That's why we have also contracts in place. I mean, you can define certain activities already with your contracts. For example, milestones, which could be related to certain payments, to certain successes, enrollment of patients, and a certain milestone which you can pay. This is one part you can manage, but the other part is really to get to be involved from the beginning, not to say after 1 year, oh, something is going wrong. Then it's far too late for everybody. And also, I would say in our times, what I have seen with CROs and sponsors, CROs are also having a lot of alert systems, and they present them to the sponsor. But the sponsor has to take them seriously also and consider them as, are they alerts which have a high impact on my clinical study? So that means, again, the experience has to take place. But I think really to avoid coming to this point means early enough being involved in your clinical trial and know where it stands, have real-time data.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more to that. I think keeping emotions out of the decision-making process and really trying to motivate people to speak up and look through the problems down to the root causes. And I also saw on the internet this method, the 5 whys. So ask why? Why is this problem existing without blaming? I think this is the tricky part. It's a leadership role, isn't it?
It is absolutely a leadership role, and it's leadership from both sides, and team building processes. For example, we had a situation when you start a clinical study, you have a kickoff meeting. So you get the teams from the sponsor and the CRO, you get them together. You have a 2-day, 3-day, depending, a kickoff meeting discussing all the details of the study, agreeing on documents and so on, which is quite nice. It's very work intensive, but it clears a lot of work. And we have sometimes kickoff meetings where we also create team building processes. And one example I had, which was very helpful one day, was we created with a team a vision, how to work together, a vision and a mission, and how to work together. And with this team, the study had problems after half a year. And then the nature started blaming each other. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? But then we went back saying, this is the vision we had originally, how we want to work together. And then suddenly the team started looking again at the vision, talking in an objective way to each other, being solution-oriented, being respectful in communication. And it certainly helped. And it was much easier to find a solution to the problem. It was not awfully, it was not that the study completely ran down, but there were some problems in some countries. And it worked well. And I think this is also something very important. And you as a sponsor, you can easily drive this process, having a team building exercise during a kickoff meeting. And of course, everybody is trying to have the main people always involved in the same team. But of course, nature sometimes plays different. So certain people leave a team. There's career development, there are changes, but still it is very important always to reallocate the team and even have another team exercise if there's a lot of changes within the teams. From both sides, this can happen.
The human factor, you're absolutely right. I think this is one of the key success factors. And it also needs from leadership side the ability to motivate people to disagree. To really speak up and not only demand agreement all the time. When I look at the study, so let's say the human factor is in control, then we also have these scientific factors that probably a drug is not effective or is not safe, so the study can't continue. Do you have a list of checkpoints that you run through when you are called in to rescue a study? That you need to check off where you say, okay, this study cannot be rescued. What are the 3 main reasons when you recommend just stop it? Yeah, don't go on, don't continue.
Well, we would hardly recommend to stop a study. I mean, this would be against the way to find solutions. I mean, if the study per se is in a good shape, I mean, the protocol would fit into the patients, or we have to change the protocol, whatever. So I think to stop a study is something which can only be done on a different level. You stop a study because there are safety issues, or there are issues with the drug, then you can stop a study. But I think if you have an ongoing study with patients enrolled, and don't forget, these are patients, they are treated with a new drug and maybe the comparable drug. So you cannot just stop it. And so you should always be in the process of finding a solution. The question could come if you need to change maybe the service provider, if you need to add another service provider. Maybe the monitoring is not going well, so you go for a different service provider just taking care of the monitoring, but the rest can remain with the original CRO. So these are the decisions we go forward. You would not say what are the key factors to stop. This is a regulatory question, I would say.
That's true. We have a question from Hans-Heinrich Nickel. Hans-Heinrich, good to see you.
It's just a question how to calculate your input, your impact, what you are bringing into these discussions or between CRO and investors. So how you calculate it in the early stage. So is it time and material based costs, or can you really estimate a kind of overall proposal for the services you might do in the next time?
You mean as part of the rescue studies, or? As
part of the rescue, yeah. So if a client needs your service and say, yeah, this is a good idea to involve you in these discussions and to bring this study, to a very good end. So what we have to pay for this? So is it a time and material, or can it be like a proposal, like this is the overall cost? Because we we think we have to do this and that and that. And so, so how you can calculate this?
Well, it's a mix. I mean, it's the proposal, of course, would bring out the details, but we would suggest how to approach the activities. It's sometimes difficult at the beginning to estimate the number of hours which might be needed at that stage. We can give a rough estimation to it, but we would always say what we have agreed with the majority of the sponsors is because after a root cause analysis, things can change again, that we would agree on a cap, which would be the maximum to be paid per month, for example, and then going into the activities. But the more, for some parts, we can clearly calculate and say this is the sum, and some parts would be looked at on a flexible basis.
Okay, thank you.
Did this answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heidrich. So when I sum up what I heard from you, it basically looks to me like the two areas, the main causes of failing trials are on one hand communication, which is managing people and managing expectations between people. And on the other hand, it's scientific reasons and safety efficacy reasons. Would that be a great summary of the last hour, or would you add other reasons that you see that I didn't mention?
Yeah, the management is, of course, the communication and the expectations. It's for me, it's always also going back to this point, because also if you don't have clear communications, expectations, it will have an influence on the communication. And of course, for the planning, we should not forget about the planning of the clinical trial, which is, I think, one of the key aspects, that you really go into a proper planning, take your time, take the resources, and try to avoid as many risks as possible during the planning stage.
I would like to stay a little bit with the planning, because I think this is also important, especially for the majority of the companies that depend on venture capital investments. I mean, when I look at venture funds, they usually have a certain period of time where they can invest, and then they need to produce results in terms of an exit, which means the clinical trial must be completed. Otherwise, they run out of money and they can't reinvest in the company, which means a trial needs to be planned really properly, because also the investors only allocate a little bit of runway that they can add to the company. But as I said, it's not a tremendous runway. What can be done, in your opinion, on the communication side to encourage CROs to not make these exaggerated sales pitches where everything is shiny and great, and you get for a certain amount of capital everything that you want, but to really communicate clearly whether the expectations of the potential sponsor when he starts the trial are really working or are not working? What can be done in your opinion to motivate CROs to come up with realistic numbers?
I think realistic numbers, I think that's both sides, because what we have experienced a lot is that sponsors have quite some unrealistic expectations on how they want to perform the clinical trial in which timeline.
Of course. I mean, everybody wants to be very quick and don't do anything. This is the reason why I asked, what can a sponsor do to get the realistic number, or to find a CRO who really starts challenging the sponsor early on. Because at the end of the day, nobody's happy. I mean, of course, I understand the scientists when for example, the standard company is scientist makes an invention at the university, then finds out that his or her invention can really change the world, then decides to jump ship and move from the, let's call it, safe creative haven university, research organization, into this novel environment development, which is a completely different mindset. And then the scientist, who's then CEO, finds some investors and then moves to the next step to become a clinical company, which is the next mindset shift. So, I mean, of course, I understand the people then on the sponsor side that maybe as a lack of experience, so they do everything the first time, they don't have the right expectations toward trials. What are your recommendations to the CROs, how to handle such situations? How can they help such sponsors?
Yeah, I think, no, it's again on the sponsor side. When you start preparing your ideas, you're collecting your ideas for the clinical trial, talk to several CROs. Go and get information from several CROs. So you will see how they will approach your clinical study. And then ask for a small feasibility is normally given by a CRO. Only when you go into a really detailed feasibility assessment, then the sponsor should pay for it. But generally, at the first end, when they have experience in the indication, and this is a selection of the vendors. So this is a critical part. Talk to vendors, talk to CROs who have the experience. Try to find out that they show what kind of experience they have. Did comparable studies in these comparable indications? What was their experience? Ask also open questions as sponsors. And because these CROs have a lot of data, and they, of course, they should share the data in a very neutral way. And so that you can see as a sponsor which CRO really provides you with details and has the best knowledge in it. And then, of course, you should discuss with these CROs what their ideas are, what their recommendations are, what their experience are. So it's not just talking to one CRO. At the beginning, you should talk, I would say, even to five different CROs at different sizes. But look at their experience, see what they can do. Do they have the regional experience, the indication, the sites? So they have a lot of these presentations they can provide you. And there must not be only the shiny dog and pony shows, but it can be really this detailed overview of their experience. And they should bring also to these presentations, should have already specialists of their teams, like the medical advisors, the data manager, the lead CRA, a project manager who has done studies in these indications. And I think this is something, if you invest also a little bit on time at the beginning and talk to the CROs, it's a building of trust and understanding. So it's not only the CRO not being open enough and critical enough, but I think it's again communication. We ask the certain questions which are relevant for you, and you will see what the CROs will come up with.
Yeah, I also think when people buy a car, they spend half a year researching, getting proposals and finding the right fit. And when it then comes to clinical trials, it's like I ask one CRO, get one offer and sign it, and just wait 2 years. It's clearly not. I would also go to the extent that money invested in feasibility study or in consultancy fees early on can save a lot of trouble later down the road. I mean, when we talk about clinical trials, we talk about including the material, then I think we talk at the lower end about a minimum of 5 million euros that goes into, depending on the indication, of course, what drug development it is and what stage it is. But I think the lower end is somewhere about 5 million. And then it just goes upwards. Clinical phase 2 trials and 3 trials are more expensive. And trying to save money on the feasibility studies can really cause a lot of financial impact later on, negative financial impact. Would you agree to that statement?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a classical approach. The more you invest upfront so that you can make knowledge-based decisions, the better, the more positive is the impact on the ongoing clinical trial later on the clinical trial performance. And but this brings us back to the point we had at the beginning, when to start preparing a clinical study. This takes time. And to do a proper feasibility takes a couple of months. It's not done within a week. It can be with 2-3 months maybe, but it takes time. And to look at the data, to perform the analysis to it, make decisions following the feasibility assessment, changing potentially the protocol. Yeah, I mean, these are things, of course, you would like to avoid, but the more you are open to it, the more realistic might be the outcome later on the study. On your plans.
It's usually a financial impact, because when I think also CROs don't do extensive feasibility studies for free. Is it right?
No, so they should not do it. It's a lot of resources. When you do a proper feasibility assessment, they can do, and the majority of the CROs we have worked with, they did it. They can do some easy feasibility based on their data. They have some good sites, they have some data available in their database, and they can give some ideas about the feasibility and recommendations which country they would go to. But then, of course, when you really want to go into details, you found a CRO, then it should be a very properly managed feasibility assessment, and then the sponsor, of course, will be asked to pay for it because it's resource intensive. And the bigger the study, the more resources a CRO would need for a feasibility assessment.
I mean, when we talk about the future of clinical trial management, I also think that since 2006, it was the year when I started working in the pharma industry, also the industry evolved. I mean, nowadays people talk a lot about personalized medicine, rare diseases, and probably also the challenges with setting up such trials are different, like the approach of the 90s, where I had the feeling everybody was talking about the one drug fits all purposes and diseases. How do you see the evolvement of clinical trials and drug development in the last 20, 30 years?
Oh, I think that's the direction would be the much more personalized medicine, and I think the technology is also already more and more developed to support the idea to have a better understanding which patients could have the best benefit of certain drugs, have the highest risk for certain drugs. I mean, this is the use of artificial intelligence, of modeling. Patient needs modeling drug development. So I think there would be much more individualized medicine be available in the future. And
and I think it doesn't that add a little bit of complexity then also to the clinical trial planning?
No, I think you would get much more information up front. I mean, I would assume that the feasibility assessment, which was recently done, calling sites and sending questionnaires to sites, might be done by a company who used this for modeling purposes, collecting a lot of information. Mm-hmm. They can run a feasibility assessment, and it's available already. And
really, are we already there yet? So that all the data is aggregated?
Yeah, in certain indications, it depends really on because these companies who develop the models and the algorithm, they, of course, depend on the input they can get. And so therefore, it's in development. But for certain indications like diabetes, you can have much more already available than for a rare disease, for example.
When I look at the trends in clinical studies, I mean, personalized medicine and rare diseases are one. Do you also see other trends that are upcoming?
Well, that's more not only the use of technology. I think this is something which is really fast developing. That was also maybe the good outcome of the pandemic. That, of course, new technology was more accepted, and also by the regulatory authorities, they easily adjusted because suddenly there was a situation that patients couldn't come to the hospitals anymore. Mm. And so there had to be new ways had to be established, which were already existing. It's not really that these ways were new, but they were now further developed and they were accepted by the companies and by the regulatory authorities, which then moved into these kind of decentralized clinical trials, so that activities were directed towards the patient, not only towards the site, but that patients could be reached in their environment. They could stay at home, and there was telemedicine was further developed. Study nurses, the so-called flying nurses, who went to the patients to do certain examinations. So these are trends which will further develop. They will not be completely virtual. I don't think so, because this has happened in the past. But I would say the future might be a hybrid version, so that certain patients for certain examinations might go to a hospital or to a special site. But then those sites would be also maybe differently arranged, that they are more close to the patient, and other parts can be at home.
This is very interesting, this concept. So the picture I got from clinical trials is that patients need to go to specialized clinics to be part of the trial. And you mentioned, and I also heard it before, that now everything changes to become decentralized. Is that really possible?
Yeah, it works. I mean, there are good examples already available for decentralized clinical trials, and a lot of tools. Even, I mean, every patient has to sign an informed consent at the beginning of a clinical trial. It's nowadays available that you can have online informed consent signatures. But then it depends on the countries in Europe. Not all countries accept these online signatures. So sometimes a wet ink signature has to be sent then to the site again. But it's possible that the patient does not need to come to the site to sign the informed consent. And so these are small developments which are regularly used already, and we had recently a webinar about this topic, and we had invited one company to present on informed consent, on this virtual informed consent, which is a great development, and so more and more will be happening in this direction. Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. There's so much technology on the market that is already there that help moving forward. It was, I think, back in 2016, 17, when I traveled to South Korea. They showed one test hospital where they implemented all gadgets that are available on the market. I mean, it was great because the patient was delivered just in time to the hospital. And then I came back to Europe and saw that we are in a completely different world because the regulatory authorities are a little bit working differently, like this test hospital in South Korea. What is your opinion on the future of trial management when we look at artificial intelligence, the digital data? What great developments do you see that will come to the market in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think... I'm not this crystal ball looker for technology because let's
just dream away.
No, I look at what is currently available, and I see the big advantages. For example, when you look at decentralized clinical trial concepts, where certain activities are brought to the patient and not patient to the site, because this is causing a lot of problems sometimes in clinical studies, that there's logistics behind, and the patient goes to the site and then suddenly he has to spend the whole day at the site because the logistics were not really thought through. Now these things are stopping because they cannot be possible anymore, and patients are not that demotivated. I mean, that they spend a lot of time going to the sites. They have to go back and forth. And sometimes within 2 weeks, they had to go 3 times to the site, which sometimes was not thought through for the practical aspects, for the logistical aspects. And if you use more of the technologies and consider more focus within the clinical studies, then I would say this would lead to reaching maybe drugs faster to market at less cost. Because when you look at artificial intelligence, just this morning I was reading about one company. They have developed the digital twin. So that, for example, there's a digital twin which can be used for have comparable data like placebo data. And so this could, if this works out, it can reduce tremendously the amount of patients who have to be enrolled in the clinical study. So this would have a big effect on shorten the timelines of a clinical study, and potentially also to shorten the costs of a clinical trial. And but I think the costs is one part, but the timelines would be very important so that drugs can come much faster to the market and reach much earlier unmet medical needs. And I think this could be one I would see in the future with the use of artificial intelligence or certain digitalization in clinical trials, and also maybe reducing preclinical activities by modeling animal models and reducing also the amount of animals which will be needed for developing preclinical data. So I think this would be my hope and vision that drugs can come much shorter to the market with less patients involved and less animals. Yeah, both.
What is digital twin that you were talking about? How does it work?
To be honest, I was just fascinated when I saw this in one short article about some startups which were recommended, and so what I understood is that the digital twin it's like an intelligent control arm for placebo. So you have the patient getting the investigational medical product, and the digital twin has the modeling and the data, as an intelligent control arm. And it was the first time this morning I heard it. I thought I could share this with you, and I will look more in detail into it, because I found this very interesting on a perspective how you can create a completely different trial design.
I mean, when I reflect on what you said in the last 1.5 hours, I think one key factor why clinical trials go southwards is the human factor. You also mentioned a couple of minutes ago that the patients can be demotivated. Patients are not a given to a clinical trial, so they're also human beings that needs to be taken care of properly and treated like human beings. And it's not just a factor. A patient is not a given. In your opinion, how important is this human factor?
Yeah, it's still the key factor. I mean, every clinical trial has to deal with humans, and so whether it's a patients, it's a sponsor, the vendors. I mean, that's all. Human factor is still most important. Even when you use the technology, I mean, you cannot use the technology without the humans behind it. And when you use technology like telemedicine and interviewing online with patients, it's a human factor behind it. Everybody has to be motivated to stay in the clinical study.
I mean, with what you said, so I wrote down this to the initial question, to this free checklist, to these 3 steps for sponsors, what to look at clinical trials and what they should take care of. So one is this communication and motivation. And when I look on the pandemic, I think this fast development speed of the vaccines, which basically were developed for safety and efficacy reasons already in other indications over a couple of decades. So the science was already well established, well set up in the first trials. But still, I mean, for a new indication, 1 year from scratch, I think in February 2020, and a year later, we were already on the market. Probably these are also these 3 factors that really played out very well. So one is the communication and motivation. I mean, the whole world was watching, and how motivating must that be for people who work in a clinical trial when they really get the feeling that they can change the world? And this is probably one message to the sponsor, or one learning that we can take from the pandemic. Motivate people that with their work, they do something good and they change the world. Would they change something in clinical trials, in your opinion, this one factor, communication and motivation, to really play that very well?
Yes, of course. I think it's absolutely that when you have the motivated people. I mean, I remember from the time when the vaccines were developed, and I was reading, also talking to some CROs where I knew that they were involved in the clinical studies for the vaccines. I mean, they were working really 24 hours. So they had teams in place. So because everybody was motivated to have the things be done as quick and fast and safe as possible. And the regulatory authorities, I mean, they really went beyond their limits and made it available, made it possible, because never ever we will have the situation that drugs could come to the market that fast as we had in the special situation during the pandemic, because generally it takes many more years to test, especially also a vaccine with all the follow-up examinations. But here the motivation was the best example, that people really worked beyond their limits to make it possible.
And I think this is a leadership role that sponsors have to take up. And this is maybe one of the factors. The second factor that I noted down is when it comes to patients, also the human factor and the motivation and the logistics around the patient. How important is that, in your opinion, to avoid failure?
Yeah, it's getting more and more important. And a lot of companies already involve patients or patient groups when they plan clinical trials, and it's highly recommended. And there will be also guidelines coming up, as far as I know, where sponsors should prove that they have involved patients during the protocol development, because they see the practical aspects. They understand the diseases in a different way and know what is important for them. And so patients will clearly play a key important role in the future.
And I think this also played probably out very well during the pandemic, that the patients were really basically taken care of properly, because everybody depended on the outcome and motivated patients to, let's say, healthy volunteers in that case, to participate in the study. And also the third part was planning, that I noted down. Planning, finance, proper
early
finance.
Stage planning.
How high is the percentage, in your opinion, that failed because of just improper planning, running out of money?
With running out of money, I'm not so sure about, because, it's difficult to get some data around it, but maybe you know more through investors. But but the planning is really the most important part, and then sometimes it's also a decision if it becomes too costly. Then you see from the planning perspective, because when you plan, you might not even have started activities around the clinical study. But if you really collect a lot of information about the costs, you can still consider whether it makes sense to start the clinical trial compared to the return on investment, or to change also the aspect of a clinical trial to make it less complex but get a lot of information already, which you need for further developments. I think it's a planning also of the financial budget should be realistic, and we always recommend even when you get budgets from the CRO at 25%, because it's always something will change and will go in a different way or goes wrong. There's always something. It can be simple things. It can be that the regulatory authorities request certain changes which have an impact on costs. So it doesn't make it's not dependent on the sponsor. It's not dependent on the CRO.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this finances, when something went wrong, it was mostly the enrollment was just overestimated or highly exaggerated. When later on you have to include other sites, new sites, of course, it drives the expenses. And then it really can happen that existing investors can't reinvest in the company because they're already at their limit when we talk about adding a couple of millions. And with an ongoing trial, going on the market, finding new investor when there are already problems is not a point the company wants to be, because it's not very convincing for the investor to go in. Or if they are bold enough to bet on a positive outcome, and they, for example, contact you and send you in, then the conditions would not be very favorable for the executive board. So it's I think asking questions early on to come up with a proper number and communicate it properly helps tremendously, because it's easier when the existing investors can cover all the expenses. It's easier before the clinical trial starts to go on the market and raise funds than when the executive team is desperate because the clinical trial is failing.
Yeah, it's clear, understandable. Yeah, no, but I think that's also a few. There are numbers available, and it's very difficult to say what is the average dollar amount for a phase 2 or for a phase 3 study. There are available, these numbers, but I think really involving specialists, helping you to consider the full budget of a clinical study is helpful. I mean, we have sometimes as companies that they really ask from the beginning, they want to have a budget from the planning of the clinical study until the marketing authorization. Yeah, so we are talking about 7-8 years of planning, but I think it makes sense so that they have also internally an idea about the investments they have to make.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It helps to just think through the quickest way to the market, at which point pharma companies need to come in, what can be covered from the investors' perspective. And the more questions people ask at the beginning, the lower the failure rate is further down the road when we just look at this isolated factor finances. So everything that happens in between these value inflection points is very tricky to finance on the market on favorable terms. I mean, this would be the 3 factors that I noted down in our conversation. It's communication, human factor, also when it comes to patients, don't forget about the patient. So it's not just a number, and planning and finance. Are there other factors that you would consider important to mention in this recording?
I think I would say that these are really the key issues, and for me it's always the communication. But I summarize always all the technical communication, human communication. I mean, there's so much communication available within the clinical trial, which is for me key. And then, of course, the oversight to all these activities. Maintain the oversight, be in real data, and be alert enough, early enough to see if something goes wrong, just to avoid that the failure rate goes up again. Yeah, so I think it's it's a very complex. It's not, for me, it's not easy to put this, as you have realized, to put this down on 3 things. It's too complex. But I would say if you have a good communication established and a realistic communication, and are open also to the input given by advisors, I think then you could be on a good way.
So
to avoid risks.
Let's come to the final part of the conversation. When something happens then in a study, what is the right way to approach you? What is the best time to call you in to rescue a trial?
I think it's we are very often involved in the planning stage already, so that we help setting up sponsors for an oversight system and establishing the communication with the CRO, looking at the contracts I want to discuss with the CRO, so that we can put a lot of information already inside at an early stage. If this is not possible, if a sponsor comes, and this is more the general case, I must say, if everything goes wrong, then as soon as possible. If you have the impression that you cannot find a solution, or it's very difficult for you to approach, or you don't have the resources. I mean, this is the most understandable part. If you're a small company, you might not have the resources to spend a lot of time doing the root cause analysis, and then we are getting involved.
So it's not only that people should call you when they have to rescue a study. So the preferred part would be early on, as you mentioned. So
we would recommend this, but to be honest, it is more the other way around. But it's no problem. But when you work so long in clinical research, as we do, and all our specialists are very experienced, you always know that, you have to deal with conflict situations. And we are very, I think, experienced in handling conflicts. And but it's always nicer to avoid them, but it's rarely the case.
It's part of the human factor, I guess. So that disagreement or speaking up sometimes also can result in conflict that has to be resolved, but this is part of the game, I guess. It's something that is part of human beings. So I don't know if avoiding conflict is the right approach. What do you think?
Avoiding conflict.
as long as people speak up and don't are afraid of mentioning potential root causes. But I mean, when I look at the companies I worked with and something went wrong, it was most of the time miscommunication early on that could have been avoided if just people were encouraged to speak up. Not everybody is a great communicator, so sometimes it really takes a lot of time to listen to people and listen to what they believe the root causes are. And sometimes it's really tricky because the results of the communication might not be what people want to hear. And this communication part is really key to success, in my opinion.
Yes, it's a communication part, but you can also, I think, try to be objective in this way by having a good risk management plan. I mean, this is again a tool, so I'm using tools like key performance indicators, governance charters, but also risk management plans. I mean, set up a risk management, and this is a living document throughout the whole clinical trial. You do this together with your vendors, and you look in regular intervals internally and together with your vendors, and see whether certain risks are coming and how to avoid these risks. And I think this is part of the speak up, definitely, but also a good, again, leadership and management, risk management. Vendor risk management is one of the important parts of oversight management.
Let me ask you one final question. What is, from my end, what is the best way to reach out to you? When somebody hears the podcast afterward and decides it would be necessary to rescue a trial or to include you in your planning, what's the best way to engage with you and your team?
Oh, yeah, always reachable via website, LinkedIn. We will have. I'm Calendly. Just drop a call. I mean, you can. I have this Calendly so that you can request for a short consultation before we can go into further details. So I think we will show up also at the end how you can reach us best. But this is the easiest way. Give a call, drop an email. We are here and immediately answer your questions. Also, when you have any questions after this session, I think this is the best way. Just drop an email.
And I think you are also, let me just pop up a slide, and I think you are also at a conference.
Yeah.
At some conferences.
Yeah, the next one is next week or in 2 weeks. It's in Munich already. And for medical device companies, where we have also a roundtable discussion. And then it continues in May in Switzerland with the Swiss Biotech Day and Outsourcing Clinical Trials Barcelona. This is one of big events in Barcelona in clinical trials, and the biotechnology days in Germany, of course, and the Biennale, which is our home run in Berlin.
So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 conferences.
Yeah, just for the next 2 months. Yeah.
Next 2 months. And of course, Barcelona with the nice beach. So,
yes.
And there people have the possibility to also engage with these conferences with the possibility to have one-on-one conversations or...
Yes. Yes, we will be present. We are at least 2 to 3 people from Lumis who will be present at these conferences. And would be great to connect with you and just drop a short email or give a call. We don't have a booth there, but it's normally easy to connect.
And these are in-person conferences.
Yes, they are all in-person conferences. So far.
We're coming back to real life. Heike, I'm done with my questions. Is there anything you would like to add at the end of the podcast that I forgot asking you and you would consider important to mention?
No, I think we have covered a lot about risk management in clinical studies and how to avoid risk and how to deal with risk when they come up. So I think, I hope I could help with putting some new ideas into certain planning stages and see that, the idea, of course, is to avoid in future times going into rescue clinical studies or trying to minimize as possible the risks in clinical trials.
That's why I will encourage everybody to reach out to you when they start thinking about a clinical trial the first time. And I think your Calendly link is very helpful, and also the conferences. Heike, thank you very much for your time, for this great conversation, to shine more light on clinical trials, how to rescue them, and why they need rescuing in the first place. And I will share your contact data then in the description of the podcast, and also add your Calendly link, so people who then listen to the podcast can directly contact you and your team. And keep up your great work and keep motivating people to manage the human factors well, because it's always a pity when clinical trials fail for whatever reasons. A lot of money is burned. I mean, we can survive that, but the pity is for the patients, because the compounds that might have had value don't reach the market. Once an asset is burned and becomes toxic, no investor invests anymore, and the idea is just dropped. And reaching out to you, your team, or CROs, starting proper planning, setting up the right communication tool helps at the end of the day the patients.
Okay, thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please share the podcast and make sure you've subscribed. Have a great day.